Welcome to Enigma Abiorto. Tonight, we follow Miss Marple into a chilling mystery, the Sapphire Teacup. A vanished heirloom, a polished table hiding secrets, and a question no one dares to answer. Where in the world are you listening from? Share in the comments, and now, let the mystery begin. The Sapphire Teacup gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its delicate porcelain catching the light like a jewel. It was the pride of Mrs. Weatherby's collection, a fragile piece said to have once belonged to a duchess. On that warm June afternoon, the cup sat innocently upon the lace-covered table in the vicarage garden, surrounded by scones, sandwiches, and an eager gathering of village folk. The occasion was nothing more than a simple garden party, or so it appeared. The ladies of St. Mary Mead leaned toward one another, whispering tidbits of gossip between bites of Victoria sponge. Retired Colonel Fitzroy boomed his opinions about lawn tennis, while young Sylvia Tarrant giggled too loudly at the rector's jokes. The roses, heavy in bloom, lent their perfume to the air, and the steady clink of teacups provided a polite rhythm to the chatter. Miss Jane Marple, in her customary place near the edge of things, observed with her knitting needles gently clacking. Few noticed her presence, and fewer still gave weight to her shrewd blue eyes as they drifted from one guest to another. She saw Mrs. Weatherby's little flutters of pride when her treasured sapphire teacup was admired. She noticed, too, the quick flash of irritation across Miss Sylvia's face when her fiancé devoted too much attention to another. Such small things seemed harmless in the gaiety of the afternoon, yet Miss Marple had long learned that human tempers, like fine china, were always close to cracking. The gaiety faltered, however, when Mr. Godfrey Bell, the wealthy solicitor from the next village, suddenly staggered back from the table. His hand clutched his throat, his teacup slipped, and the fine sapphire vessel shattered upon the lawn. A hush fell, broken only by Mrs. Weatherby's shrill cry of despair at the ruin of her treasure. Yet attention swiftly shifted for Mr. Bell collapsed among the roses, his face contorted in pain. For a moment, the gathering froze in disbelief. Then the rector shouted for someone to fetch the doctor, while Colonel Fitzroy attempted a fumbling revival. The younger guests gasped and whispered, half in horror, half in scandalous delight. But the older women clutched their pearls and murmured words like fainting spell and indigestion. Miss Marple did not move from her seat. Instead, she bent her head slightly, eyes fixed not on Mr. Bell but on the tea-table, where cups stood in orderly rows, except for one's mashed to glittering fragments in the grass. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as her mind began quietly to piece together the fragments of a puzzle no one else yet saw. And so it was that an ordinary garden party in St. Mary Mead, framed by roses and lace, became the stage for something much darker, the curious case of the Sapphire Teacup. The village of St. Mary Mead was not one to let an incident of such magnitude pass without swift interpretation. By the following morning, scarcely a doorstep in the high street or a pew in the church had failed to host some whispered account of the garden party calamity. To some, it was an unfortunate case of a gentleman's weak constitution succumbing to summer heat. To others, the sudden collapse of Mr. Godfrey Bell hinted at something far more sinister. At Mrs. Hartnell's grocer's shop, the talk was particularly lively. "Mark my words," she declared while weighing out currants for Mrs. Price Ridley. It was no fainting fit. A man doesn't crumple like that without a reason. Poison, I shouldn't wonder. I read about a case in the Illustrated London News only last month involving arsenic in a chocolate cream. Her voice carried, and the small knot of customers leaned closer, half horrified, half thrilled. Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. And what would anyone gain by poisoning Mr. Bell? A respectable solicitor, and prosperous too. Her tone suggested prosperity itself was enough to invite envy, and her sharp glance toward the younger villagers betrayed her fondness for attributing trouble to modern ways. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Mrs. Weatherby could not stop lamenting the loss of her precious sapphire teacup. "A duchess once sipped from it, Jane," she moaned, as if the grandeur of the artifact rendered its destruction a greater tragedy than poor Mr. Bell's collapse. Shattered into shards, and right there among my best roses. The symbolism is dreadful. Miss Marple, who had called to offer quiet sympathy, only nodded and murmured soothing words. She knew Mrs. Weatherby's grief was genuine, even if misplaced. At the post office, Mr. Polk, the postman, had his own view. It'll be his business dealings, you see, he confided to anyone within earshot. A solicitor handles money, doesn't he? Folks trust him with wills, with deeds, with all manner of documents. Easy enough to make an enemy if he puts a line wrong in a contract. Someone might have had cause to settle a score. He tapped his nose as if the entire matter were plain to a man of the world like himself. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage that afternoon, the whole village had woven its web of conjecture. Some believed Mr. Bell had been struck down by Providence for his pride. Others whispered of gambling debts or romantic entanglements. A few dismissed it as an accident of digestion. Yet among all these theories, one curious fact lay ignored: the peculiar placement of the broken teacup. Miss Marple, who had observed it most closely, could not dismiss it so lightly. The fragments had fallen in such a way that they suggested not merely a dropped cup, but one snatched from the hand with startling violence. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, though the needles did not click as swiftly as usual. Her mind wandered back over the faces at the party, Colonel Fitzroy's red flush of exertion as he bent over Mr. Bell, Sylvia Tarrant's too bright laugh when the rector had spoken of marrying the maid who had served the tea with trembling hands. Each detail seemed insignificant on its own, yet Miss Marple knew from long experience that human behavior, much like her knitting, formed patterns when observed with patience. The village continued its chatter into the evening. Curtains twitched, lights glowed, and voices carried across hedges. St. Mary Mead was a place where even the faintest scandal could thrive for weeks, and this was no faint scandal. For the first time in years, people walked a little faster down dark lanes, locked their doors more carefully, and speculated over supper with a shiver of excitement. Something dreadful had entered their quiet lives, and though they did not yet know its shape, they felt it pressing in at the edges. Miss Marple, for her part, set aside her knitting and poured herself a cup of tea. She allowed the steam to curl upward while her gaze rested on the orderly row of china cups in her cabinet. They gleamed softly in the lamplight, unremarkable and whole. Yet the image of the shattered sapphire teacup lingered in her mind, as if to remind her that even in the most polished of settings, danger might brew unnoticed until the moment it spilled. She sighed, folded her hands, and thought of poor Mr. Bell. Whatever had struck him down, whether sudden illness or deliberate malice, she was certain of one thing: the answer lay not in medical texts or laboratory instruments, but in the hearts and tempers of those who had shared that summer afternoon among the roses. And Jane Marple, quietly seated in her small parlour, resolved to listen more closely than anyone else in St. Mary Mead. The following day dawned with a curious tension in St. Mary Mead. The sunshine seemed as bright as ever, the hedgerows heavy with blossoms, and the postman's whistle cheerily carried down the lane, but the village was restless. Word of Mr. Godfrey Bell's collapse had moved beyond the boundaries of ordinary gossip. Now there was an official element. The police had been called, and once uniformed men began asking questions, the village knew it was no longer a matter of speculation, but of inquiry. Inspector Craddock, a stout man with a kindly face that could sharpen when the need arose, arrived from the county town with a sergeant in tow. He was not unfamiliar with St. Mary Mead, nor with its tendency to magnify trifles into melodrama. Yet, as he sat at the vicarage table, listening to Reverend Weatherby recount the suddenness of Mr. Bell's fall, even Craddock could not dismiss it as a fainting spell. The solicitor had been hale and hearty, a man who enjoyed his food and could be counted upon to down a second glass of port. Something about his collapse troubled the inspector and his sergeant. was soon dispatched to make inquiries among the guests. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, had examined Mr. Bell the evening before. He now offered his professional opinion to the inspector with his usual bluntness. "The man's heart may have been under strain," he said, polishing his spectacles, "but I cannot rule out other causes. His expression, his convulsions do not sit easily with a simple seizure. It will require a post-mortem. Until then, one cannot speak with certainty." Such words, repeated by Mrs. Weatherby's maid to her cousin and then to half the village, carried the weight of doom. By the time Miss Marple heard the account, it had grown into a declaration that Mr. Bell had been poisoned beyond all doubt. She did not contradict the tale, but tucked the detail quietly away, as she did with all things. At the Blue Boar Inn, the sergeant was seen asking questions of anyone who had stood near the tea-table. Mrs. Hartnell, with her usual force, insisted she had noticed a peculiar look on Sylvia Tarrant's face just before the commotion. Young Miss Sylvia, when asked, admitted she had been startled, but by nothing more sinister than Mrs. Weatherby's overzealous laugh. Her cheeks flushed red, and she stammered more than once. The sergeant, who was a straightforward man, marked her nervousness down as a sign of possible guilt, but Miss Marple, when later she heard of it, only smiled gently. She had seen many young girls fluster under the weight of serious questions, guilty of nothing more than their youth. Colonel Fitzroy, puffing out his chest, gave a full account of his gallant attempt to revive poor Bell. "Dashed unlucky, you know," he declared to Inspector Craddock. "One minute, Bell was praising the tea, the next down like a felled ox. I attempted artificial respiration, of course. Had a go at loosening his collar, too. But nothing seemed to make a difference. He shook his head with solemn gravity, as though his failure was a personal affront." Craddock, who had heard many such self-important accounts from retired officers, simply noted the colonel's words and moved on. Mrs. Weatherby, still desolate over her broken teacup, contributed little beyond lamentations. "Such a treasure, Inspector. It was the centerpiece of my collection, and now shards. Oh, and poor Mr. Bell, of course. Such a dreadful business." Her emphasis was not lost on Miss Marple, who suspected that Mrs. Weatherby's sorrow was as much porcelain as flesh and blood. Yet beneath her flutterings there might lie knowledge worth extracting. Mrs. Weatherby had been close to the serving table and could not have failed to notice something. One only needed patience with her. As inquiries continued, other names began to drift into circulation. Mr. Polk, the postman, recalled that Bell had handled certain wills and deeds that had caused murmurs in the district. A farmer spoke of a boundary dispute, settled in favor of Bell's client, which had left the opposing family sour. There were whispers, too, that the solicitor's prosperity was not entirely free of questionable dealings. Nothing concrete, but in a small village, rumor often served as both entertainment and indictment. Amid this swirl of conjecture, Miss Marple moved as unobtrusively as ever. She called on Mrs. Price Ridley to deliver some knitting wool, listened as the old lady aired her suspicions about gambling debts, and stored the remark carefully. She paused to speak with the rector's wife about church flowers, gleaning from her casual chatter who had stood where at the tea-table. Each conversation was gentle, seemingly innocent, yet each thread wove itself into the growing fabric of her understanding. What struck Miss Marple most was the curious matter of the cups. Each guest had been served in turn, and though the maid had done the pouring, Mrs. Weatherby herself had arranged the order on the tray. Yet when she described the event to Inspector Craddock, her account was muddled. Had Mr. Bell reached for his own cup, or had one been handed to him? Did he add sugar, or had it been added already? Such small uncertainties seemed trivial to most, but to Miss Marple they were precisely the sort of details that could spell the difference between chance and intention. Later that evening, as twilight settled and the first lamps glowed in cottage windows, Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth. She recalled, with the clarity of a long habit, the way the maid's hand had trembled as she passed a cup to Mr. Bell. She remembered the faint shadow of annoyance that crossed Sylvia Tarrant's face, and the way Colonel Fitzroy had elbowed forward with his hearty good cheer. She even remembered with peculiar sharpness how Mrs. Weatherby's eyes had darted anxiously toward her collection as the cups were set out. Each fragment might have been nothing, but together they suggested a pattern not yet discernible to anyone else. She did not seek to outpace the police. Inspector Craddock would pursue his formal inquiries with diligence, and she bore him no ill will for overlooking the subtleties of human nature. Yet she knew from long experience that people betrayed themselves, not by the facts they recounted, but by the feelings they attempted to conceal. In their words, their gestures, their glances, lay the truth, and Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and her endless memory of human foibles, would be there to see it. The following day promised to bring more questions, perhaps even the results of the doctor's examination. The village, so accustomed to its peaceful rhythms, now lived in anticipation of news. Housewives lingered longer at their garden gates. Men paused on their bicycles to exchange tidbits, and children listened wide-eyed to hushed conversations they only half understood. A shadow had fallen over St. Mary Mead and every soul in it, whether guilty or innocent, moved beneath its weight. Miss Marple, setting her teacup carefully in its saucer, murmured a soft remark to herself. "It is astonishing," she said, "how very little it takes to reveal the true nature of a person. A single broken cup, and the whole village shows its cracks." With that, she resumed her knitting, the rhythmic click of her needles blending with the ticking of the clock, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of suspicion gathering just beyond her cottage door. Inspector Craddock prided himself on being thorough, but even the most careful of investigators is often drawn first to the path that appears the most straightforward. By the third day after Mr. Godfrey Bell's collapse, the village of St. Mary Mead had already decided who must be responsible, and Craddock, though not wholly convinced, found himself listening with increasing seriousness to the same name repeated in various tones of certainty. That name was Sylvia Tarrant. Miss Sylvia had been the subject of chatter long before the incident at the garden party. Pretty, restless, and too fond of bright laughter for the taste of the older villagers, she had caught the eye of more than one young man. She was formally engaged to Henry Fortescue, a rising clerk from the solicitor's own office, yet her attentions were not always so firmly anchored. Several had noticed her exchanging smiles with men who were not her fiancé, and her fondness for admiration was as much remarked upon as her collection of fashionable frocks. That she had blushed and faltered during the sergeant's questions seemed, to the collective mind of the village, the clearest evidence of guilt imaginable. She looked positively stricken, Mrs. Price Ridley told anyone who would listen. "You mark my words, it was she who passed Mr. Bell the cup. Jealousy, I shouldn't wonder. I've always said those pretty girls come to no good." The colonel, too, was quick to add his opinion. "I saw her myself, hovering near the table. Shifty, if you ask me. Young women these days have no discipline." His mustache bristled with indignation as though the matter had been settled by military decree. Inspector Craddock, collecting these accounts, was not blind to the village's eagerness to condemn the girl. Still, he had his duty, and when he reviewed the statements, there were indeed curious points. Sylvia had been closest to the table when Mr. Bell's cup was served. She had admitted to feeling startled, though unable to give a clear reason. And she had been, according to the maid's testimony, the last person to linger near the tray before the solicitor received his tea. In such cases, proximity and nervousness were often enough to draw suspicion. Miss Marple observed these developments with her usual composure. She sat one morning with her knitting in the vicarage garden while Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Hartnell discussed Sylvia's downfall with relish. "It's a tragedy, of course," Mrs. Weatherby said, eyes bright with morbid satisfaction. "But really, if one looks at her conduct, always laughing, always drawing attention, it was bound to end in some disaster." Mrs. Hartnell, nodding vigorously, added that she had never trusted a girl who painted her lips on a Sunday. Miss Marple did not interrupt their certainties. She merely asked a mild question or two about who had seen Sylvia take her cup and whether anyone had noticed Mr. Bell's manner before he drank. The answers were vague, yet delivered with great assurance. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a curious trait of human nature that certainty grew firmer as memory grew less reliable. By the time gossip passed from one ear to the next, it hardened into fact, no matter how tenuous the origin. Meanwhile, Sylvia herself grew pale beneath the weight of suspicion. She kept to her mother's cottage, venturing out only to fetch a loaf or to attend service with downcast eyes. Young Henry Fortescue, stiff with injured pride, stood beside her but avoided meeting her gaze. The engagement, once a matter of whispered admiration, now seemed strained, the villagers watching for signs of a rupture. Henry's loyalty was questioned by every observer, and Sylvia's guilt was accepted with the inevitability of an unpleasant truth. Inspector Craddock visited her directly. His questions were firm but not unkind. "You were near the tray when the cups were arranged, Miss Tarrant. Did you hand Mr. Bell his tea?" Sylvia shook her head, denying it vehemently, yet her hands trembled as she twisted her handkerchief. "I never touched his cup. I was speaking to Mrs. Weatherby at the time. She insisted, though her words faltered under scrutiny." Craddock made note of her agitation and left with little satisfaction. To him she seemed frightened, perhaps of guilt, perhaps of something else entirely. Dr. Haydock's post-mortem report added fuel to the fire. It revealed that Mr. Bell had indeed ingested a substance inconsistent with natural illness. Though the precise poison could not yet be identified, there was enough to establish that foul play had occurred. The inspector now had the certainty of a crime, and the most convenient suspect stood already outlined by village opinion. Sylvia Tarrant, in the eyes of many, was halfway condemned before the case had even properly begun. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her parlour window, listening as two young maids whispered outside her hedge. They spoke breathlessly of Sylvia's supposed jealousy, of a quarrel with Henry, of glances exchanged with other men. Miss Marple knitted calmly, her mind recalling countless similar tales from her long years in the village. She had seen many young women maligned for behavior that was more foolish than wicked. What struck her most was not Sylvia's supposed jealousy, but the eagerness with which others clung to the notion. It was, she mused, far easier to blame the girl who laughed too loudly than to question the motives of respected figures. She thought again of Mr. Bell's position as solicitor, his control over sensitive documents, his dealings that might leave bitterness in their wake. If one wished to poison a man, there were many motives to be found in money, in pride, or in revenge. Jealousy of a young woman's heart seemed, to Miss Marple's seasoned judgment, far less convincing. Yet she knew well that Inspector Craddock must follow the evidence as it appeared, and appearances were rarely kind to those who seemed frivolous. The sapphire teacup, shattered upon the lawn, hovered in Miss Marple's thoughts. If Mr. Bell had taken his tea from that vessel, the choice of cup might have been more than a coincidence. Mrs. Weatherby's insistence on displaying her prized possession could have offered someone the perfect opportunity. Did the intended victim choose the cup himself, or had it been contrived that it fell to him? The answer to that small question, Miss Marple felt certain, might unravel the larger mystery. For now, however, the village pressed upon Sylvia with the weight of suspicion, and Inspector Craddock could not ignore the collective voice of Saint Mary Mead. The first suspect had emerged, clear in the eyes of all, though Miss Marple quietly doubted. She suspected that the truth, like the cracks in Mrs. Weatherby's shattered porcelain, lay hidden in the finer lines, lines overlooked by those too eager to settle upon the most obvious explanation. As the day closed, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and looked thoughtfully into the lamplight. "Poor girl," she murmured to herself. "They would condemn her for her blushes, and yet it is not blushes that kill." With that, she poured herself a fresh cup of tea, careful to select her own plain china, and reflected that the heart of the mystery had yet to be truly touched. The following morning, St. Mary Mead stirred with a renewed sense of importance. News of the post-mortem, whispered from the inn to the churchyard and down the lanes, had solidified the villagers' belief that they were at the heart of a genuine murder case. With Sylvia Tarrant marked out as the natural suspect, the conversations grew more animated, the speculations more elaborate. But while most eyes remained fixed upon the girl's supposed guilt, Miss Marple's attention had begun to stray in another direction. She had taken her customary walk down the high street, pausing to nod to the greengrocer and to exchange pleasantries with the postman, before stopping at Mrs. Weatherby's house. The widow had not recovered from the loss of her prized sapphire teacup. She met Miss Marple at the door, wringing her hands and lamenting once again the dreadful ruin of her collection. It was irreplaceable, Jane. Quite irreplaceable, she said, ushering her guest into the drawing-room, where the remaining cups were arranged in an elaborate cabinet. One feels as though a piece of one's own heart has been crushed, and to think it should shatter upon the lawn among the roses. There is something almost symbolic in it. Miss Marple murmured sympathy, her eyes resting quietly on the gleaming cups within the cabinet. She studied their arrangement of rows of delicate porcelain, each cup carefully matched to its saucer. Yet she noticed at once that the spacing was uneven, a gap left where the sapphire teacup once stood. Her gaze lingered, and in that pause she saw something curious. One of the saucers in the back row bore the faintest of scratches, as though something sharp had pressed against it recently. It was a small thing, no more than a hairline mark. But Miss Marple's eyes did not pass over such details lightly. She made no remark to Mrs. Weatherby, who was lost in her lamentations, but tucked the observation away as she so often did. When she left the house, she turned the thought over in her mind. Why should a saucer, displayed in a cabinet, bear a fresh mark? Had it been recently handled, perhaps even swapped with another? If so, the order of cups at the tea-table might not have been quite as innocent as Mrs. Weatherby supposed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage garden once more, ostensibly to admire the roses, but in truth to examine the ground where the sapphire teacup had fallen. The fragments had been cleared away, yet faint traces remained. A glimmer of porcelain in the grass, a patch of disturbed soil where the pieces had been gathered. Standing there, she noticed the curious pattern of the shards as she remembered them from that day. They had not scattered naturally in a wide arc, as a dropped cup might. Rather, they had fallen in a close cluster, almost as though the cup had been set down with deliberate force and broken against the earth. It was, she thought, the difference between an accident and an intention. Inspector Craddock, when he called later that day, seemed disinclined to consider such subtleties. "The matter is plain enough," he told the vicar, with Miss Marple quietly present. "Bell was poisoned. Someone placed it in his tea." The girl, Sylvia, had an opportunity, and she behaved with nervousness under questioning. That will do for the time being. The vicar, looking distressed, glanced toward Miss Marple. "Do you think it is possible?" he asked her softly. Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, gave him her gentle smile. "I think, dear Reverend, that human nature is not always so simple as it appears. We must be careful not to mistake agitation for guilt. Young people are often frightened when accused, even if they have nothing to hide." Craddock gave a small grunt, but made no further comment. He respected Miss Marple, though he often found her observations maddeningly oblique. Still her words lingered, even as he set his focus firmly upon Sylvia. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her knitting. The rhythm of her needles soothed her thoughts, but her mind was alive with detail. She recalled the maid who had served the tea, her hands trembling as she moved between guests. She remembered Mrs. Weatherby's anxious glance at her, collection, and the odd fact of the scratched saucer. It all suggested a subtle rearrangement, a manipulation that would have gone unnoticed amid the gaiety of the garden party. If Mr. Bell had been guided toward a particular cup, the sapphire teacup, then his fate had been sealed not by chance, but by design. What then of motive? Mr. Bell was not universally beloved. His profession as a solicitor gave him access to the private matters of many households. He had drawn up wills, managed estates, and settled disputes. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that nothing stirs resentment more quickly than money and inheritance. A single line in a document could alter a fortune, and with it the course of lives. She suspected that beneath the polite surfaces of Saint Mary Mead lay grievances more potent than youthful jealousy. The following morning brought a visit from Mrs. Price Ridley, who called on Miss Marple to deliver a length of lace and stayed to pour out her opinions on the case. "Mark my words, Jane, it will be that girl Sylvia. These pretty, flighty creatures always come to a bad end. And Mr. Bell was far too important a man to have enemies of consequence." She spoke with such authority that Miss Marple merely smiled and let her continue. Yet in her heart she disagreed. Important men, she knew, always had quiet, respectable enemies who concealed their resentments behind polished manners. After Mrs. Price Ridley's departure, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard. There she found young Henry Fortescue, Sylvia's fiancé, sitting gloomily on a bench. His face was pale, and his hands were clasped tightly together. He started when Miss Marple greeted him, but he did not turn her away. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," he said. "Everyone's saying it was Sylvia, but she didn't, I know she didn't. She may be foolish at times, but she's not wicked. I can't bear to see her treated like that." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You must hold firm, Henry. In times of trouble, loyalty is often tested, but the truth will come, and it is not always where the crowd believes it to be." Her words seemed to comfort him, though he looked doubtful. When he rose and walked away, Miss Marple sat in quiet thought. She had noticed something in his manner, a certain unease that did not wholly spring from concern for Sylvia. He had avoided her eyes at moments, as though keeping something unspoken locked within. It was, she reflected, another thread to follow. As the bells tolled the hour, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but she held in her mind the image of that scratched saucer, the trembling maid, the calculated placement of the sapphire teacup. These were not the marks of chance. They were the marks of intent, subtle but unmistakable to eyes trained over years of observing the small betrayals and secret motives of human nature. The village might cry out against Sylvia, and the inspector might pursue the obvious path, but Miss Marple knew better. Somewhere among the polite smiles and whispered gossip of Saint Mary Mead, the real hand behind Mr. Bell's death was concealed, and she, with her patient knitting and her quiet mind, intended to find it. The mood in Saint Mary Mead had grown darker with each passing day. What had begun as excited whispers of scandal now settled into an air of unease. Neighbors eyed one another a little too closely. Conversations broke off when a new listener drew near, and doors that once stood open for idle chatter were now shut more firmly. A crime among them meant suspicion among them, and suspicion had a way of exposing things people would rather keep hidden. Inspector Craddock, for his part, pressed on with his inquiries. The confirmation of poison left him determined to narrow the circle of suspects, and he found more than one villager willing to reveal details that placed others in an unfortunate light. "You must understand," Mrs. Hartnell explained, bustling into the station with a face brimming with righteous duty, that Mr. Bell was not as universally admired as some would have it. He had a way of putting people in their place, and he never did suffer fools gladly. I dare say he made enemies. She paused dramatically before adding, "and not just among the young and foolish like Sylvia." Her words proved accurate, though she spoke them only for the satisfaction of having her say. Beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, secrets stirred. One such secret emerged at the vicarage, where Reverend Weatherby, after much hesitation, confided to Inspector Craddock that Mr. Bell had recently been engaged in drafting a will for a wealthy widow in the neighboring parish. "It is not my place to discuss parishioners beyond our own flock," the Reverend said uneasily, "but I could not help overhearing when Mr. Belle visited her after church. She seemed most distressed, speaking of her nephew's displeasure. If that document altered her estate in any significant way, there may have been some who resented it deeply. Craddock nodded, making a careful note of the matter. Money, he knew, was motive enough to sour the best of families. Meanwhile, Colonel Fitzroy found himself at the center of attention when it was revealed that he and Mr. Bell had quarreled not 2 weeks before. The colonel, confronted by Craddock in the presence of several eager villagers, blustered at once. "Nonsense, Inspector, a mere disagreement over boundary lines." "Perfectly civil. Men of the world, you know, are bound to have a difference of opinion." Yet the colonel's flushed face and quick temper betrayed a deeper sting. As Miss Marple recalled, Bell had handled several estate disputes, and such disputes often left scars long after the ink dried. The colonel's loud denials only sharpened the whispers against him. Miss Marple observed these developments with her usual quietude. She found herself invited to tea at Mrs. Weatherby's, once again, where she was regaled with more lamentations over the loss of the Sapphire Teacup. But beneath those complaints, Mrs. Weatherby let slip something of more interest. "Mr. Bell was always so particular, Jane. He would have the best of everything, the choicest slice of ham, the first of the strawberries, and, of course, he insisted upon taking his tea in the finest cup available. I flattered myself that he admired my taste. Why, he reached for the Sapphire Teacup himself that very afternoon." She sighed, patting her handkerchief. Such a pity no one can appreciate how flattering that was. Miss Marple smiled politely but made no comment. She had seen Mr. Bell select the cup, but what struck her now was the eagerness with which Mrs. Weatherby wished the detail remembered. It was as if she feared the implication that someone else had guided the choice. The insistence itself was revealing. People rarely emphasized what was unimportant to them. At the same time, other murmurs reached Miss Marple's ears. The maid who had served the tea was said to have been recently dismissed from another household for dishonesty. Nothing serious, only small pilferings, yet the stain remained. When questioned by Craddock, she denied any mischief, weeping bitterly. But Miss Marple, who once paused to offer her a kind word, noted how the girl flinched at the mention of Mr. Bell's name. Fear was written plain on her face, though of what or whom Miss Marple could not yet tell. Even young Henry Fortescue was not without his shadow. Though loyal in appearance to Sylvia, there were whispers that his position at Mr. Bell's office was not as secure as it seemed. One villager had glimpsed him leaving Bell's chambers late at night, his face pale and drawn. Another claimed to have overheard a heated exchange between a clerk and an employer. When asked, Henry insisted it was only a matter of accounts, yet he looked strained and his gaze faltered. To Miss Marple, his discomfort carried the stamp of a deeper burden. Thus, the village found itself divided. Some still pointed to Sylvia, too flighty, too pretty, too nervous for her own good. Others turned their whispers toward the colonel with his temper and his quarrel. And a few speculated darkly about Henry or the maid, noting that opportunity often lay in the hands of those least suspected. It was as though the shadow of the Sapphire Teacup had cast cracks across the whole village, each one revealing flaws that had long been concealed. Miss Marple, sitting one evening with her knitting, considered these strands. She thought of Mrs. Weatherby's insistence on Bell's choice of cup, of the scratched saucer in the cabinet, of the maid's trembling hands, and of Henry's unease. Each pointed to secrets, though not yet to a clear conclusion. What she knew, with the certainty born of long observation, was that people often betrayed themselves when pressed. A small confrontation, a seemingly innocent remark, could expose more than hours of formal questioning. Already the tension in the village was doing its work, peeling back the layers of pretense. That night, the air in St. Mary Mead felt heavy with things unsaid. Lamps glowed behind curtained windows, voices rose in low arguments, and somewhere a dog barked against the silence. The village was uneasy, for it sensed what Miss Marple had always known. that murder is rarely the act of a stranger. It is born of human weakness, of grudges and pride and desperation. And in the small, intricate web of St. Mary Mead, every thread was tightening. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and smoothed her lap. "It is beginning to show," she murmured. "Not the truth itself, but the cracks where it will come through." She blew out her lamp and settled into bed, knowing that by morning the village would reveal still more. In the pressure of suspicion, people could not help but betray their secrets. The unease in St. Mary Mead had settled like a summer fog, clinging to every conversation, every look across a garden gate, every hushed remark at the post office. The village, which had thrived for years on the innocent pleasures of gossip, now found itself tangled in something darker. A murder among them was already extraordinary enough, but by the end of the week, a new development would cast suspicion in directions few had anticipated. It began with the arrival of Inspector Craddock at the Blue Boar Inn on a damp morning. He had summoned Henry Fortescue to answer further questions, and the young man appeared pale and strained. The inspector wasted no time. "You worked closely with Mr. Bell, did you not? Tell me, Fortescue, what matters were occupying him in the days before his death?" Henry hesitated, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. "Routine affairs," he said at last. "Some wills, property transfers, nothing unusual." But his words lacked conviction, and Craddock's sharp eye caught the flicker of unease. He pressed further, drawing out the reluctant admission that Mr. Bell had been revising a will for a wealthy widow, Mrs. Templeton, which excluded a relative who had expected a large inheritance. The detail matched what Reverend Weatherby had overheard, and Craddock felt a tightening in his net. If the solicitor had indeed angered such a family, the motive for his death grew broader than youthful jealousy. Yet even as this line of inquiry unfolded, another, more dramatic event shook the village. That evening, as dusk fell and lamps began to glow in cottage windows, Mrs. Weatherby's maid, the very girl who had served the tea at the garden party, was discovered in a state of collapse behind the vicarage wall. She had not been poisoned, as some breathless villagers first assumed, but had fainted from fright. When revived, she wept hysterically, declaring that she had seen a figure lurking near the vicarage garden at night. Someone tall, cloaked in a dark coat, watching from the shadows where the sapphire teacup had fallen. The revelation caused a stir unlike anything that had preceded it. Villagers gathered in knots to discuss the mysterious watcher. Some claimed it must be the ghost of Mr. Bell, restless for justice, and declared it was the murderer returning to the scene of the crime. Inspector Craddock, though unimpressed with tales of phantoms, was troubled enough to order a search of the grounds. Nothing was found but footprints in the damp soil, the kind made by a man's boots. The gossip swelled to a fever pitch. The colonel was immediately named as the likely culprit, his stature and temper fitting the description all too neatly. "I've always said he prowls about at night," Mrs. Hartnell confided with relish. "Military men can never sleep properly." Others whispered that Henry himself might have returned to recover some incriminating trace, his guilty conscience driving him back. A few, still clinging to their original theory, insisted it was Sylvia, though the notion of her donning men's boots stretched credulity. Miss Marple, listening to these theories with her quiet patience, thought rather differently. She had long observed that those who commit a crime often betray themselves by revisiting the scene not out of necessity, but from a compulsion born of fear or triumph. That someone had been seen there suggested guilt, but perhaps not in the way the villagers imagined. A guilty mind might need to reassure itself that the evidence was gone or take secret pleasure in surveying the chaos it had caused. She visited the vicarage garden the following morning, ostensibly to admire the roses, but her sharp eyes studied the patch where the footprints had been found. The soil was soft from rain, yet the impressions were oddly incomplete, as though the walker had paused uneasily, shifting his weight. To Miss Marple, it suggested hesitation, not confidence. Someone had come, but without boldness. Someone is afraid of discovery. Meanwhile, another revelation came from Doctor. Haydock, who had been examining the contents of Mr. Bell's stomach with a more specialized eye. He reported to Inspector Craddock that the poison was most likely digitalis extracted from foxglove, a substance that in small doses could pass as medicine, but in larger amounts was deadly. The village had foxglove growing in abundance, and more than one household kept tinctures of it for heart ailments. The knowledge that such a poison was both accessible and easily concealed deepened the mystery. Anyone could have obtained it. When word of the poison spread, a new layer of suspicion unfolded. It was recalled that Colonel Fitzroy's late wife had once been prescribed digitalis, and some claimed that a small bottle had remained in his medicine cabinet. Others remembered that Dr. Haydock himself kept tinctures in his surgery, though few dared accuse him outright. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, whose rheumatism gave her cause to dabble in home remedies, was suddenly whispered about. In short, the field of possible suspects widened rather than narrowed. Sylvia Tarrant, once the prime target of suspicion, found her burden somewhat eased. Villagers still eyed her with mistrust, but the talk of a mysterious figure in the vicarage garden diverted attention. Henry's unease grew more pronounced, however, for the idea of wills and property disputes brought his employer's affairs under scrutiny. If Mr. Bell had made enemies in his professional dealings, Henry might know more than he cared to reveal. His pale face and stammering answers only added to the uncertainty. That evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by her lamp, she reflected on the events of the day, the maid's frightened testimony, the shadowy figure, the revelation of digitalis. All these were pieces of a puzzle. But to her, the most telling detail was not the ghostly figure nor the poison, but the simple fact of the scratched saucer she had seen days earlier. It had spoken of preparation, of careful planning, long before Mr. Bell raised the fatal cup. Murder, she knew, was rarely an act of sudden impulse. It was the product of intent, woven quietly into the fabric of ordinary life. As the clock chimed the hour, Miss Marple set down her knitting and murmured to herself, "It is becoming clearer," she said softly. "Not who, not yet, but how. And once one knows how, the who is seldom far behind." She sipped her tea thoughtfully, while outside, the village lay restless under the weight of suspicion, knowing that another shadow had fallen across its quiet lanes. The mystery of the Sapphire Teacup had grown thick with speculation, and the atmosphere insane. Mary Mead was as taut as a string stretched to breaking. Her shadow in the vicarage garden, whispers of digitalis, and half the village suspected in turn it was a fertile ground for theories, yet no resolution drew near. Inspector Craddock, increasingly weary of contradictory accounts, pressed forward with methodical questions, but Miss Marple knew the truth would not be revealed by blunt force. Human nature required something subtler, something that let guilt slip through in an unguarded moment. Miss Marple had always trusted her memory of patterns, those small echoes of behavior she had catalogued over her long life. She had seen quarrels flare at garden fences, grudges fester in families, and secrets slip from lips under the gentle prodding of an apparently harmless remark. And so she resolved upon a quiet test tone that would never seem like a test at all. She began with Colonel Fitzroy. Meeting him at the post office, she offered a bright smile and spoke of her roses. They do thrive in this weather, though one must watch for foxglove creeping too near. Such a handsome plant, don't you think? Though I suppose some would call it dangerous. The colonel, taken aback, gave a loud laugh. Dangerous? Oh, I dare say. Pretty enough flower, but I've no interest in gardeners' poisons. Give me a sturdy oak, Miss Marple, not these delicate blooms. Yet his voice carried a forced cheer, and his mustache twitched as he spoke. She marked it down as a touch too eager, a man reminding himself to dismiss suspicion rather than simply dismissing it. Later, she visited Mrs. Weatherby under the pretense of returning a borrowed shawl. As they sat together in the drawing-room, Miss Marple admired the widow's porcelain collection. Such treasures, my dear. It is curious, is it not, how the choice of a particular cup can change the whole atmosphere of a gathering. People do notice when a guest selects the finest one, and if by misfortune that cup should break, it is remembered far longer than an ordinary piece. Mrs. Weatherby clasped her hands, her voice trembling. Yes, Jane, dreadful indeed. But Mr. Bell did admire it. He always reached for it when he called. I cannot be blamed for his tastes, can I? The note of defensiveness rang sharply in the air. Miss Marple merely nodded, but her eyes lingered on the woman's fluttering hands. It was not guilt she detected so much as fear of being suspected, fear of losing social standing, a useful distinction. Henry Fortescue, however, was a different matter. Miss Marple encountered him by chance near the churchyard, where he stood gazing down at the graves with a troubled expression. She paused beside him, remarking gently, "It is curious how people sometimes find themselves tied by papers and signatures more firmly than by chains. I always think solicitors must bear a heavy burden, handling the affairs of life and death." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "You mean Mr. Bell's cases?" She smiled serenely. "Only that people rarely forgive an unfavorable will. Such matters can make enemies for a man." His face turned pale, and he muttered something about errands before hurrying away. Miss Marple watched him go, noting that his guilt seemed not of murder, but of some other entanglement he feared might surface under the inspector's gaze. It was the maid, however, who gave the most telling response. Miss Marple visited her one afternoon, bringing a small tin of biscuits as a gesture of kindness. The girl, still shaken by her supposed vision of a figure in the garden, accepted the gift with tears. As they spoke, Miss Marple remarked in her mild way, "It must have been so difficult, carrying the tray with so many delicate cups. I should think one might easily mix them up. A guest might even be given a cup he did not expect." The maid's eyes widened, and her hands clenched in her lap. "I tried my best," she whispered. "It wasn't my fault. I just did as I was told." She stopped herself abruptly, her cheeks blanching. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "Told, my dear." The girl shook her head quickly, retreating into silence. But the slip was enough. Someone had guided her, perhaps directed which cup was to be handed to Mr. Bell. That was no accident. The next day, Miss Marple arranged to take tea at the vicarage with Inspector Craddock, present. It was, she explained sweetly, only fair to support Mrs. Weatherby in her grief. Yet she had another purpose. When the tray of cups was brought in, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How very charming," she said, selecting her cup carefully. "It always strikes me how much thought goes into the arrangement of cups and saucers. So many little choices. One never knows how important they may prove." Her words hung in the air, and she watched each face in turn. Mrs. Weatherby fidgeted. The colonel scowled impatiently. Henry shifted uncomfortably, and the maid nearly dropped the teapot. Inspector Craddock, though puzzled, noted their reactions. It was not proof, not yet. But for Miss Marple, it confirmed her sense that the crime had not been one of random opportunity. The sapphire teacup had been singled out, prepared, and placed into Mr. Bell's hands with deliberation. The murderer had relied on something very ordinary, that vanity or habit would guide Bell to the finest cup. Yet there had also been a hand nudging fate, ensuring the choice. Those details, so small and easily overlooked, were the hinge upon which the whole case turned. As the guests departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. The village had offered its secrets, and the suspects had shown their cracks. Now she had only to wait, to let the pattern complete itself. "It is very near," she murmured to herself as Craddock took his leave. The truth is always there if one only watches how people behave when they think no one is watching. Outside, the village moved uneasily through another evening. Curtains were drawn early, lamps glowed against the dusk, and whispers carried across hedges. The murderer was still among them, hiding behind respectability, but Miss Marple was already closing in. Her final test had given her the shape of the truth. The time would soon come when the threads would be drawn together and the shattering of the sapphire teacup would be explained in full. The air in St. Mary Mead was heavy with anticipation. A week had passed since Mr. Bell's death, and the village had grown restless under the weight of suspicion. Neighbors spoke less freely, gossip was delivered in lowered tones, and even the children seemed subdued, sensing the disquiet in their elders. Inspector Craddock, after days of careful but fruitless inquiries, confessed to the vicar that he was no closer to a resolution. "Every thread leads to another knot," he admitted. "The whole village is a tangle." It was at this point that Miss Marple, with her gentle voice and unassuming manner, suggested a gathering. It might help, she said, if those who were present at the garden party could come together once more. Sometimes, when people speak in one another's company, things are remembered that might otherwise remain unsaid. Craddock, weary but trusting her instinct, agreed. And so it was arranged that the principal figures should meet in the vicarage drawing-room on a mild afternoon, with Miss Marple presiding as quietly as a hostess at tea. They came, each with their own anxieties. Mrs. Weatherby arrived first, fluttering nervously and clutching a lace handkerchief. Colonel Fitzroy followed, stiff-backed and red-faced, determined to preserve his dignity. Sylvia Tarrant came pale and subdued, Henry beside her with a tense, watchful expression. The maid, reluctant but compelled by the inspector's summons, entered with eyes lowered. Inspector Craddock himself stood by the hearth, notebook in hand, though his gaze often wandered to Miss Marple, as if seeking reassurance that this unconventional approach might yield results. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting in her lap, looked around the room with serene composure. "I do not propose to trouble you with accusations," she began softly, "but I think it would be useful if we considered once again how it came about that Mr. Bell drank from the sapphire teacup. A hush fell. The mere mention of the shattered vessel seemed to chill the room. Mrs. Weatherby spoke first, her voice sharp with emotion. "He admired it, Miss Marple. He always admired it. He reached for it himself, and I had no hand in the matter. I would not have guided him. He chose it freely." Her eyes darted around the room as though daring contradiction. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Yes, Mrs. Weatherby, that is what you have said before. Yet it is curious that your maid remembers differently." The maid started, her face blanching. "I only did as I was told," she stammered. "I didn't think it mattered." Her words, spoken in a rush, drew every eye upon her. Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "And who told you, my dear?" The girl wrung her hands, unable to speak, until Craddock pressed her firmly. At last, she whispered, "It was Mr. Bell himself. He said he wanted the finest cup, and Mrs. Weatherby nodded." This seemed to exonerate the mistress of the house, but Miss Marple only shook her head slightly. "Ah, but that is the point. Vanity can be relied upon. Mr. Bell could be trusted to choose the best cup. The question is, who prepared that cup before it was ever placed on the tray?" Her eyes drifted toward Henry Fortescue. He stiffened visibly, his lips tightening. Sylvia gave a small cry, clutching his arm. "Henry, you didn't," she whispered. He did not answer. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost sympathetic. "You see, it was not jealousy nor sudden impulse. It was deliberate, thought out in advance. Digitalis is not easily obtained by chance. But you, Mr. Fortescue, had access to Mr. Bell's office. You knew the wills he was preparing, the enemies he was making. You also knew your own position there was precarious. There was talk, was there not, of dismissing you, of exposing certain irregularities in the accounts?" Henry's face was drained of color. "He would have ruined me," he muttered hoarsely. "He said he would see me struck off, that I'd never work in the law again. I begged him, and he laughed. His voice rose, shaking with anger and despair. Yes, I put it in the cup. I knew he would choose it. He always did. I thought no one would ever suspect, and why should they? Everyone was eager enough to blame Sylvia. Sylvia gave a sob, covering her face with her hands. The Colonel swore under his breath, while Mrs. Weatherby gasped and clutched her chair as if to steady herself. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grim. "That will do, Fortescue. You have said enough." He signaled to the sergeant waiting outside, who entered swiftly to escort the young man away. For a moment, silence hung over the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Then Mrs. Weatherby burst into tears, mourning both her shattered cup and the scandal that had befallen her gathering. The Colonel muttered about disgrace and dishonor, while Sylvia sat motionless, as though stunned by the enormity of what had unfolded. Miss Marple, calm as ever, resumed her knitting. "It is often so," she said quietly, more to herself than to the others. "A little vanity, a little desperation, and a great deal of human weakness. One must only watch for the pattern." Her needles clicked softly, the sound gentle and steady in the midst of turmoil. Inspector Craddock, though shaken by the suddenness of the confession, felt a deep respect for the elderly woman who had drawn it out with such delicate skill. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I might have pursued the wrong suspect entirely, but you saw what lay beneath." She looked up at him with a modest smile. "It is only a matter of human nature, Inspector. People are not so different, whether in villages or in cities. They reveal themselves if one knows how to listen." Outside, the evening sun slanted across the church spire, casting long shadows down the lanes of St. Mary Mead. The village would talk of nothing else for weeks to come. But for the moment, in the quiet of the vicarage drawing-room, the case of the Sapphire Teacup had reached its end. Or nearly so for Miss Marple. There always remained the gentle aftermath, the reflections on what such tragedies revealed about the hearts of ordinary people. The days following Henry Fortescue's confession settled over St. Mary Mead like the slow clearing of a storm. Yet though the skies brightened and the roses bloomed as they always had, the air carried a lingering heaviness. The villagers, who once delighted in their gossip as in a parlor game, now spoke more cautiously, aware that their words had danced so near to injustice. The image of Sylvia Tarrantpale, accused, nearly ruined by suspicion, remained in many minds, a reminder that hasty judgments could wound as surely as any blade. At the Blue Boar Inn, voices were lower than usual. Mrs. Hartnell, who had been most vocal in condemning Sylvia, now spoke of her with regretful softness. "The poor child," she said, shaking her head. "We were too quick to blame her. Pretty girls do draw mischief, but it is not always their own doing." Mrs. Price Ridley, unwilling to admit she had been wrong, insisted instead that she had always suspected Henry. "It was plain as day to me. The way he carried himself was shifty, very shifty. I could have told you he was hiding something." Few believed her claim, though no one challenged her too strongly. The village had had enough of sharp tongues. Sylvia herself withdrew into seclusion. Though Henry's guilt had freed her from suspicion, the scandal clung to her like a shadow. She walked less often in the lanes, and when she did, her eyes were lowered. Some said her engagement was broken beyond repair. Others whispered she might yet forgive, out of pity or weakness. Miss Marple, reflecting on the girl's plight, thought it more likely that Sylvia would eventually leave St. Mary Mead, seeking a fresh beginning where whispers could not follow. Such departures were common after village scandals, and often the only way to find peace. Mrs. Weatherby, meanwhile, remained inconsolable about her teacup, though she acknowledged the tragedy of Mr. Bell's death and the horror of Henry's crime. Her conversations returned unfailingly to the shattered porcelain. "It was irreplaceable, Jane," she sighed to Miss Marple, who called to sit with her one afternoon. "Every piece of my collection has a history, but that cup was the jewel. A duchess drank from it, you know. Now, nothing is the same." Miss Marple listened kindly, offering tea and sympathy. She understood that Mrs. Weatherby's grief, though seemingly frivolous, was genuine in its own way. People mourned what they valued most, whether human lives, reputation, or fragile china. Colonel Fitzroy, relieved to be free of suspicion, resumed his hearty routines with renewed vigor. He walked the lanes with his stick, spoke loudly at the inn, and offered to escort Sylvia on her errands, as though bestowing protection. Yet behind his bluster some noted a quieter note. Perhaps his own brush with suspicion had unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. He no longer dismissed the fears of his neighbors so readily, and seemed oddly gentler in his judgments. Inspector Craddock departed after securing Henry's transfer to the county town. Before leaving, he called on Miss Marple to express his gratitude. "You have the gift of seeing straight through to the heart of things," he said. "I would have pursued the wrong path without you." She smiled, modest as always. "It is only that people cannot help but reveal themselves, Inspector. A small slip, a glance, a habit, they speak more clearly than confessions." He shook her hand warmly, promising to call again when his duties brought him near. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her ordinary life with little alteration. Her knitting needles clicked as they always had, her garden flourished, and she continued to exchange pleasantries with neighbors at the post office. Yet beneath her gentle manner lay the quiet certainty that the village had been altered. Not by the removal of Henry Fortescue. Villagers came and went, scandals flared and faded, but by the memory of how quickly suspicion had spread. It would linger, perhaps making the villagers more cautious in their judgments, though Miss Marple doubted such caution would last long. Human nature, she knew, had a way of slipping back into its old grooves. One evening, as the sun set in a wash of gold over the thatched roofs, Miss Marple sat by her window, reflecting. The case of the Sapphire Teacup had been, in its essence, a story of vanity, pride, and desperation. Henry, fearful of disgrace, had grasped at a deadly solution. He had counted on Belle's vanity to ensure the choice of the finest cup, and he had guided the maid with subtle hints. Yet in the end, it was not science nor evidence that betrayed him, but the small cracks in his composure, the flinching at a question, the hesitation under Miss Marple's gaze. "One sees the same patterns again and again," she murmured, watching the swallows dart across the twilight. "People are not so very complicated when one has watched them long enough." The Sapphire Teacup, once the pride of Mrs. Weatherby's collection, lay in shards in a box at the back of a cupboard. Its destruction had seemed, at the moment of tragedy, the greatest of losses. Yet it had become the key to unmasking a murderer. A broken cup, a broken life, a village made uneasy by the reminder that beneath its roses and lace, darkness could dwell. Miss Marple sipped her tea, content to let the village settle back into its rhythms. But she knew, as she always did, that somewhere, someday, another small clue would catch her eye, and another mystery would quietly unfold among the hedges and lanes of England. For now, though, peace returned to St. Mary Mead. The church bells rang on Sundays. The children played on the green, and the gossip at the post office returned to safer topics. Yet in every conversation, however trivial, there lingered a faint echo of the Sapphire Teacup, a reminder that human nature, with all its secrets, was never far from the surface.